Mhm. I'm doing this video, uh, sort of running the risk that many people either won't resonate with it, so it's for anger repressors. And I didn't even see this until almost near the end of reversing anger repression. So I actually don't know how many people will connect with it. It's this thing that you realize when you really heal trauma, like really heal it and reverse the repression, that you actually are responsible for a lot of the shit that has gone on in relationship, that you have a full hand in that. But it's so easy to miss it when you repress anger. Well, the first thing I want to say is that how can you take responsibility for an emotion that's buried and running things from behind the scenes? You can't really take responsibility for all the fallout of that because you don't even know what's really happening. And I want you to pay attention, anger repressors, to the shutdown or the disconnection or the ignoring that you do when you're hurt or you're angry. And I have a lifetime of this, so I know it well. And I've come out of it, substantially out of it through this work. And here's the pattern. The pattern is in an upset or a trigger, shutdown. So you go quiet. You may still talk, but it's like you're just not expressing what you want to say, right? Because with anger is repressed, it's just holding your whole life force back and other emotions are being held back with it. And you know from our vulnerability inquiry that you can't be vulnerable, that there's a block to it if you have anger repression. Well, the other thing that there's a block to is taking responsibility fully for your part. And so here's the thing, what I want each of you to do right now is to stop and notice the mind that says, I take responsibility, because that's a bamboozle. You may, but I'm talking about something that you're not aware of yet. So the defense that's coming up now, if it's coming up, that says, no, I take responsibility, it's my husband or my wife that doesn't, just watch that, because that's the defense. That's like keeping the anger down, where it's like, it's not my problem, it's theirs. That has to change in trauma healing. You have to take responsibility fully for your part, and it's difficult. It's much easier as an anger repressor to stuff that down and focus on the other person and not really see the extent to which the shutdown and the disconnection is contributing to the problems. This is a really, really hard one for anger repressors to see. For years, I would said it was a complete lie, that I was taking responsibility for my part, but I wasn't even taking responsibility for my own anger. I didn't even know it was there, but it was operating and running things. So in a dispute, I would shut down, I would go quiet, and that would mimic presence. So I'd feel justified in it. Therefore, the presence, you have to be careful because it enmeshes with the quiet shutdown of the anger repressor. You're going to want to pay attention to when there's a dispute with somebody that you relate to. When there's a dispute, I want you to notice the pattern where it's like you just stop. You stop being open or opening to that person. That's what I call shutdown. And then I want you just to notice what happens in the shutdown. I want you to do some inquiry, if you will. When you're shut down, I want you to pull that person up and say, I don't have to ignore them. Or even, I don't have to punish them. Or I don't have to punish them by disconnecting or ignoring them. And don't do it now, just write it down, because there's so much I want to talk to you about. But there's your inquiry to start to bring you out of the shutdown. So I would ask you to just watch everything that comes, because what you'll find is that your body and mind is almost like trying to prove to you that you have to. You have to shut down, that you have to protect yourself, that you have to punish them or ignore them. Now, that does incredible damage. When you're an anger repressor, you can't see the damage, but it does incredible damage to a relationship, as much or more than somebody who's visibly angry, because it's anger and it's not being processed. So somebody who's visibly angry, like a hurt repressor, doesn't process their emotions. So there's that. So if you're with somebody as an anger repressor, if you're with somebody who's visibly upset a lot, that's not somebody who's processing their emotions. We don't want to give them kudos for that, as if that's just being open and honest because they're repressing hurt. But here, the holding back of the anger is also not processing it. So whether we're really identified with it or whether we're repressing it or holding it back, it's contributing in some way to the problems. But what I want to see, we already know, though, that the visible upset of anger can create problems because it's not being processed, and the fear underneath it isn't being acknowledged often, or the hurt. There's that, especially for sadness repressors. But then there's almost the opposite, where the anger repressors might be trying to go to sadness or hurt or vulnerability too soon, or even forgiveness too soon, when they're actually storing anger. And so the storing of the anger is what's creating the issues. Now, I didn't see this until I reversed the repression and then was in relationship with anger repressors. And so the first time it's like mirror, because when they had a dispute with me, I wanted to address it. I wanted to speak about it. Even if it was uncomfortable, I wanted to talk about it. But I noticed that they would shut down on me. Well, they thought that they were just sort of doing their usual thing. Like, they're really unconscious. They're not thinking about it that much, actually, but they're not seeing the pattern. Well, in KI, we call out the patterns. So if I saw somebody doing that, even in my own community, I would say, and I have said, that that's the repression there, and that that's contributing to a great deal of any conflict that's here. But when they're shut down, they can't hear it. Like, sometimes when people hear it, they start to own it, but it's very difficult until they process the repression. And then it becomes clear the extent to which they are contributing to the problem. So when I saw it happening to me, what I wanted to say to the anger repressor is, number one, you're not telling me what's wrong. And that's what I used to do. So I don't even have a shot here. If I am actually doing something that's not appropriate or whatever, I don't even know, because you're not telling me. So there's nothing that I can do. I can't address the problem. We're not having a conversation about it, which could often, could anger me. That'd be a natural emotion. If somebody is literally upset with me, but not talking to me about it, a natural response would be to anger, which would trigger them more. So that's where the anger repressor gets into a hole, because you're holding the emotion back and you don't see how it's contributing, but it is contributing. And the people that receive that, they're confused and sometimes triggered by it. Naturally, because they just want to deal with the issue, but you're hiding. So anger could come out. But if anger comes out to the anger repressor, that sinks us deeper into the hole, because that's our shadow. So I want to remind you guys who are in relationships, you may or may not know it yet, where one of you is an anger repressor and the other is a sadness repressor. And that's a big part of the conflict right there, is the repression. But I don't think that anger repressors really see it. Always, sometimes we do, but I think you actually have to come out of repression to really see it. And the part that I'm talking about here is not the shutdown. That's the thing that makes not taking responsibility happen, because I'm not taking responsibility for my own emotion there. So I'm shutting down around emotion. That emotion, it's literally impossible to take responsibility for whatever damage that repressed emotion is creating here, because I'm repressing it. That's the issue. So what anger repressors and what I used to often do is avoid anger and then try to make it right by going to safer places that are not really opening me up to vulnerability. Strangely, if I'm a sadness repressor or anger repressor, if I keep opening to hurt and sadness, that looks vulnerable, but it still skews the relationship, because I'm not actually owning what's really going on. And I'm trying to be vulnerable when are sad, or you know how it is, I just want to be open, we say to ourselves, I just want us to be vulnerable. Mm-mm. Because the anger repressor and the people in the relationship with you, they know this. It's we don't know it. We don't know the extent to which us holding back that emotion makes it so that we can't take responsibility fully. So that's why I'm sharing it, just so that you can start seeing it. And I would say, look, go to your partners if you're an anger repressor and say, it's hard to hear it and you might get upset. But I want you to say, first, do you think I get angry, but I don't really acknowledge it to you and just listen? Most likely, if they're not a people pleaser, they're going to say yes, but you already know that. And then I want you to say, if I'm holding back my emotions, do you think I'm taking responsibility for whatever part that I have? If they're not a people pleaser, they're most likely going to say, yeah. It's like, it's really confusing. They might not be able to put their finger on it, but they already know that it's a two-way street. But with anger repressors, we sometimes think it's like a one-way street. Like, they're angry. I'm not responsible for this. Well, here's the other thing I have to tell you. If you don't know, this is like good news and bad news. Anger repressors have a lot of anger underneath the surface. And although many of us anger repressors would like to disqualify ourselves from that, the truth is, when we do the somatic work, there's a ton of anger. And that's the bad news because we didn't think we had it. But the good news is there can be transformation now, because now we understand the root of our suffering. Like before, maybe we didn't understand that repression and trauma is driving everything. But the good news is now we know. So what do we do about it though, right? We have to do the work. And of course, I've been giving you work to reverse the repression. What I want to do now is talk about taking responsibility. And the first thing I want to say is, I wouldn't take responsibility or even seek forgiveness or ask for it until you do a little bit of processing on the primary repression that's contributing to the conflict in the first place. Because it feels false. I'll just tell you, I've seen it happen. After coming out of anger repression, an anger repressor has a few of them have shut down on me, and then they didn't open to anger, but I kept trying to talk to them. But when they came to me, they tried to own their part, or they didn't own their part at all, but they really couldn't, even if they tried, because they weren't being responsible for how their shutdown contributed to the issue between us. That's a big issue, actually, for anger repressors, because we want so much to have peace and harmony and deep relationships, but we can't if we can't take responsibility for our part. And I don't see how you're going to take responsibility for your part if you can't take responsibility for a primary emotion that's definitely contributing to it. If I could just impress upon you as anger repressors what it's like to be on the receiving end of that. But like, a lot of anger repressors will see other anger repressors shutting down, and they'll like, oh yeah, I understand that, because they do it. If you've never been on the receiving end, let me tell you what it feels like. It feels like a very unloving, cruel, violent thing, actually, to shut down in that way. Even though you're not expressing anger, the way that you disconnect and the way that you pretend like your repression isn't a big part of the issue is a gaslight to those of us in relationship with you. It's like a constant gaslight, because we know, for example, that you're angry, or we know that you're shutting down, but you won't admit it quite often. How many anger repressors say, I'm actually shutting down on anger right now, and I know that that's contributing to this. So they don't say that. And so it feels like a gaslight, because the anger repression is affecting the relationship deeply. But one of the parties, the anger repressor, isn't acknowledging it. So the person that's in a relationship with that, it's like it's hard for them to trust their eyes and ears and what they see, because there's a deception going on. And you won't see it. I promise you, you're not going to really see it until you reverse the repression, what that's like. You also don't know what it's like, perhaps, maybe you do, to be in a relationship with someone who is upset with you, but will not tell you what it is. Incredible amount of damage that does, because you can't have an open relationship. You can't really talk about what matters. You're held back from all that. And so that it can't be that kind of intimacy and vulnerability that we need to grow deeper in those relationships. One way that we as anger repressors don't take responsibility is, and it's so innocent because we can't help it, is that by not being able to express anger, we then identify with a deficiency story. And usually that's just about us, right? Woe is me. So we may not know why we have the deficiency story, but I'm telling you that it comes from the trauma and repression. It's a childhood false identity. And when it comes in because we can't feel and express our real emotions. But the false self, when it comes in, it tends to get us focused and even sometimes super fixated on the feeling that there's something wrong with me. And then it's still not really authentic, because now it's just, you're focused on that, identifying with that identity. When what would really help the relationship is if you went down and felt and allowed the emotion that you're holding back that creates the identity. Once the identity is in place, again, if you notice, there's a fixation with self, and it's an identity thing. And so that right there is blinding, because you're believing it all, but you're not seeing that it comes from the repression necessarily. So when you're in it and you're in a dispute, that entity, that identity has to protect itself and attack, because it has to protect the anger. So right there is a good reason to go deeper than just questioning identity and triggers. What your partner really wants is for you to be able to open to them. But if you're just questioning identity, you can't open to them, because it's the repression that keeps you from fully being yourself. There's a lot of then things that come together to make it very difficult for an anger repressor to take responsibility for their part. Okay, here's a little personal share. So yeah, my husband was going through a lot of stuff personally before our divorce. And as a sadness repressor, he was getting angry. I was coming out of repression, so I wasn't shutting down anymore. Well, the issue though was we couldn't go to vulnerability because he was holding back on the sadness. So when I came out of anger repression, he was angry because of the sadness repression. The anger was a safety net for him. The anger for me was the authentic emotion coming out. And that once it came out, I was ready for vulnerability, but he can't help it. He couldn't go there. It's not a judgment. It's just trauma. Because he couldn't go there, it felt like we couldn't go deeper together, and it felt like a divorce was the right way. Never intended for us to get back together. We spent 4 months apart, completely apart, didn't talk. When we came back together, I noticed that he was actually changing and very much interested in vulnerability. Well, what that did is it helped me to shine a light back on me, to see my part of it. And I have to say that my part of it, well, I was coming out of repression. So what do? I sometimes joke that hell hath no fury for an anger repressor coming out of anger repression, because it's anger. So my part of it is that two things, I think. One, the bigger thing is when I was in repression, I wasn't taking responsibility for how I was contributing by just not speaking up, not sharing my real emotions with him. That was a big issue. Now, reversing the repression, that was no longer an issue, right? Because now I can get angry, and he's already angry because he's a sadness repressor and is afraid of the hurt. So you can just imagine one person who's angry because of sadness repression and one person who's angry now can get angry coming out of repression. We have to go somewhere else So I have to say then that what Chester will have to do now and is doing is taking responsibility for how his sadness repression contributed to it. But my part is to see how my anger repression contributed to it. And then when I came out of anger repression, my part was there were times at which I wanted to be able to process my anger and not put it on him, but I did. And it just has to do with the dynamic because he gets angry very quickly, protecting the hurt. And there's not always sort of time for me to go, okay, or it doesn't feel safe sometimes for me to say, I need a break. Sometimes he wouldn't let me have that break because he was angry. So I didn't set the boundary for myself and for him strong enough. I was still repressing. What I should have said is, no, I have to have a timeout here. Otherwise, I'm just going to put my anger on you. Well, I've learned to do that now. And we have this thing is if we do get into a dispute, we have an hour to process that first. So everything is changing now. Do we still get into little, what's the word? Disputes? Yes. I mean, we're in a relationship, but the dynamic is so different now. So by the end of the relationship, or the conversation, I'm able to take responsibility for my part because I know my anger. I can feel that now, along with fear or hurt, or even if I'm not feeling, sometimes I don't get triggered at all. It just depends. But if I feel something, I can take responsibility for all that because I'm not repressing. And now I think his job, his work, is to take responsibility for how the sadness repression has contributed to the problems and may continue to if we don't both do that work. Because trauma fucks relationships up if we don't wake up to the patterns, right? But things are really good here, which gives me the space to now help others. Because if I had a big issue with my relationship, I'd be focused there. But things are happening now, the transformation. So I want to share with you what I'm seeing. What my life is like now is as a former anger repressor, is I don't hold anything back. Which means sometimes I'm angry. Sometimes I'm just saying, I'm afraid. No, that's hurtful. So I'm just expressing everything. And he's doing that. So it's just a beautiful dance when both people are doing that. Taking responsibility is what it is. So here's my concern with this video. It's like the premature forgiveness thing. Anger repressors don't want to open to anger. They're very afraid of that. So when they recognize that there's forgiveness that needs to happen, sometimes they'll rush to the forgiveness. They'll say or use practices that bring about this sense that I forgive the person or I forgive myself, but they don't understand repression. So that's buried. And just forgiving somebody doesn't at all get to buried emotion. It's buried. So the forgiveness is happening kind of on the surface. It's premature because you have to get in touch with the anger first. You have to forgive everything within yourself. You have to allow it all. But if you start to try to forgive somebody else while you're still resenting them by storing anger, it's not healthy. Is what I've seen. It's a bypass. It's like, I don't want to feel something. Well, let's just make it right here. See, make it right. But you can't really make it right if you're avoiding your authentic emotions, right? How are you going to make that right when you're holding yourself back and trying to forgive on top of that? And taking responsibility, when I bring this subject up, my concern is that anger repressors will try to do inquiry on taking responsibility, but not go to the anger. So let me be clear what I'm saying here for anger repressors. To fully take responsibility, you have to reverse the repression. You have to come out of shutdown. When you're shutting down with somebody, you have to, in that moment, recognize the state. You don't have to. I'm just saying, if you want to be free, unless you want to suffer, is when you're shut down, start doing inquiry, as I've given you, that takes you out of that so you can just start to express. And you want to stay in process until you're really aware of how you're feeling, at least. Even if you haven't sort of put the trigger to rest, you want to bring it all into awareness. And then, of course, you don't want to super identify with it. So it's like, I'm not angry. Yes. And by witnessing it, you're not identifying with it, you're allowing it. And then by continuing to allow it, now you know that you're angry or that you were. So when you go back to your partner or whoever it is, you can take responsibility. Now, you can say a bunch of things. You can say, well, I was angry, but actually I was holding it back. I was repressing, and I was back in my room just bullying you quietly, angry, like planning to ignore you in different ways, and just saying, that's violent. That's very violent. And I'm sorry that I did that for you. But of course, that's my trauma. That's no excuse. But that's how I contributed to this, is that I was really angry, but I just didn't open to it. And I was basically lying to you about it. And then that starts a different conversation at that point. It at least sets the tone or provides a space for the other person to be vulnerable. But it's hard. If you're an anger repressor, if you don't do that processing, then you come back to the partner. Remember, snake in the grass. Snake in the grass. Even if it comes back and it works, you're still storing anger. So even if you come back not processing the anger, you come back, you're storing it. That's the snake in the grass. What does that mean? It means you're putting on a false face. It means you're actually angry, but you're not acknowledging it. So there's deception when you come back. So you can imagine somebody dealing with that, how after a while they would not trust you because you say that you're not resentful and you make an apology or whatever else. But I know you're storing anger, because the next time we get into an argument, you're going to shut down again, and you're going to come back to me again, and you're going to say, all is well, I forgive you. But I know that you don't. On some level, you're storing your anger towards me. There's the snake in the grass thing. And by the way, I'm a trigger for you, the anger repressor now. I know that because I'm speaking up. That's triggering you and may shut you down more. So that's what it can feel like on the receiving end. Even if your partner or friend can't articulate that energetically, that's how it feels for people sometimes. And I know that there are sadness repressors right now who are in relationship with anger repressors, and they're going, yep, thank you, Scott. My God, thank you. Because I've been dealing with this for years. Yeah, I get it. I totally get it. We're really, really misunderstanding each other. The sadness repressor is so misunderstood because they're getting angry because that's their solution until they can open to the sadness. It doesn't make it right for them to put their anger on you if they're doing that, but that's what's happening. So you can see the compassion in that and how they're misunderstood. And then the anger repressors are misunderstood and they even misunderstand themselves because they're trying desperately to keep it together. They really do love, like everybody does, or most of us are coming from a good place, but we have trauma. So the anger repressor is misunderstood. They're trying desperately to stay safe. They want to love. They want to be open, but they can't. And a lot of times they don't even know why. And that's the misunderstood part. So when you keep seeing your partner who just keeps shutting down, you might think that they're callous, for example. I'm sure that there are people who saw me shut down and thought, he's an asshole, because they felt the violence in it. But they're just misunderstood. It's like they're just protecting themselves. It's not callousness. They're not actually intending to be mean. They're shutting down for safety. So everybody's misunderstood. When we reverse repression, the misunderstandings stop. The clarity comes in. I think that's it on this topic. If you want to do this work, you're already doing it. Reversing the repression is what brings you to taking responsibility for your side. Here's another inquiry that I'll give you is just keep doing what you're doing, working with the primary repression. As you start to feel and allow the anger or the sadness or whatever that's repressed, when you really start to make it conscious and it really starts to settle more, like where you acknowledge you're angry, it's all in awareness. Nothing is hiding. You see the thoughts, you feel the emotions, and you just let it all be. Then go back into that area where you were holding that anger and say, I can take responsibility now, which is another way of saying I can be vulnerable now, because it's kind of the same thing. And see if the contraction goes no. And if it does, all that means is you have more work. You can't end the repression in one fell swoop. So you still have that there. But at least now you're starting to learn that it's the anger repression that keeps me from being vulnerable, which means keeps me from opening up, keeps me from taking responsibility for the emotions that I'm not opening to. And that'll just help you at the end. It'll actually help you in a relationship. If you can imagine as an anger repressor or a sadness repressor, you pull aside, you're shut down. You do inquiry like, I can express myself here or something. And then you watch and you start to come out of the shutdown. Now there's some anger, or you're conscious that anger is there in some way. It's no longer repressed. Then as you process it more, come back to, I can go in there and be vulnerable now, or I can take responsibility for my part. Just check into your body. If the body says no, it doesn't mean that you can't go in and be honest. You can go in and say, look, I know there's still repression here. I'm very familiar with that. However, I also know that I was angry and I just processed it and I got in touch with it. So I'm angry and hurt and afraid, and I can be vulnerable, to a certain extent, but being honest to say, quite honestly, until I come out of this repression, I don't really see what I'm doing. That's a really, really loving thing to say, because you don't see. And if you could just be really honest, I think that's what people want. Even if it's like, I can't be vulnerable, or I can be vulnerable, but I can't really say what I want to say because I repress anger. Speak, in other words, it just helps. But this work is mostly about processing. See, it's mostly about just doing that inquiry and then just seeing what happens. I'm just trying to help people because they're going through this transition, like you're reversing repression. But in the meantime, you have to have relationships. And before you're out of repression, you're going to have disputes and you're going to shut down. So I'm just trying to give you a few tools to open back up to that person temporarily, to work that out, be vulnerable, and then just stay in the process so that the next time it happens and you shut down, you go back to the same inquiry. What eventually happens, and I'm going to leave you with this, is when you come out of repression, it's all online. You're not unaware of what you feel at that point. So it's just taking responsibility is much easier, because you don't have to do that extra step of bringing the anger into awareness. You're just aware of the anger. And so you can more immediately take responsibility. There doesn't have to be as much fallout or damage when there's no repression. The repression creates so much fallout. Coming out of repression, the fallout is much less because you're not shutting down. The shutdown contributes to the problem. So if you're not shut down around anger, you can just more explicitly say to someone, I'm angry right now, or even worse, but at least that's honest. See, and you can then take responsibility. You can say, because of this anger, I said this, or I did this, and I'm sorry. That was mean. That's actually very ruthless, or whatever it is. You can take responsibility now. I hope this helps.